This recording is part of the Ernest Thompson Seton Institute's Oral History Project. The Institute was established to reintroduce Mr. Seton's work to new generations and to bring researchers and scholars together who have interest in Seton's impact in the fields of natural science, art, literature, and outdoor education. This oral history was collected by telephone from Mrs. Linda Davis from Cimarron, New Mexico on September 26, 2019. State your name.
Linda Mitchell Davis.
Where you were born and when you were born.
I was born in Denver on July 11, 1930, and then came back as soon as my mother was able to travel to New Mexico. And I was raised on a Tequesquite Ranch in Harding County, about 18 miles east of Mosquero, New Mexico.
And your parents' names?
My mother was Julia Sunt, S-U-N-D-T, Mitchell. And my dad was Albert Knell, K-N-E-L-L, Mitchell.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
I had two brothers. They're both deceased now. I had a brother that was Thomas E. Mitchell II, who was born in 1932, and a brother, Albert Julian Mitchell, who was born in 1934, and my mother died when he was 2 days old. So my dad raised us in a very isolated corner of New Mexico.
And did your dad ever remarry?
He didn't get remarried until in 1957. He was a widower for many years.
And did he stay at the ranch?
Oh, yeah, he stayed at the ranch. He died on the ranch. He stayed on the ranch all he was involved with it. He was sort of the livestock agriculturist of the last century. He was a very well-known rancher and agriculturist.
You always lived on the ranch yourself, correct?
Yes, I lived there. I was homeschooled till the Second World War came along, and then the lady that had been helping teach us went to war, so to speak. She was with the Red Cross the First World War, and they called her back, second one. So I was educated until about the 5th grade on the ranch. My grandfather knew him. My grandfather, T.E. Mitchell, knew him because my grandfather was the wagon boss for one of the big outfits in Northeast, where everybody, that was before barbed wire, and everybody ran their cattle together up on the plains between the mountains here at Cimarron and the Texas state line. When we were still a territory then.
Your grandfather was
Thomas Edward Mitchell, T.E. Mitchell, and he ran the Bartee Cross outfit in the Ute Creek and Tequesquite Creek valleys. But he had worked cattle up closer to the Clayton area and Des Moines area and in there. And I think that's when he became acquainted. So that was way back in your grandfather's early days when he first came to this part of the world.
1893 and 1894.
Well, my grandfather met him because that was a vast cattle grazing area.
Right.
And they had different ranches all shared it. And so my grandfather knew of him, being a naturalist and his interest in the wolf population and things like that.
My grandfather certainly would have talked to your grandfather about the wolf population.
Yes, I'm pretty sure. And the population of the wildlife in general. I think that most of the cattlemen that ran cattle in this general area were very protective of the deer and the antelope and the various game and the wildlife.
Did you talk with my grandfather when he came to visit you?
I lived in Albuquerque, and that was where I got to know your grandfather. Was when we lived in Albuquerque, and I was schooled in Albuquerque from 1941 to 44. Went to the Manzano Day School. The reason that I met him, that I got to know him, was when they were going to Albuquerque. They would do it once a month. Your grandfather got very worried that there was nothing, the children that were left behind due to the war effort and all. There was nothing special for them. They weren't able to learn about anything except, and I went to Albuquerque because they had the Manzano Day School, and they would take people that came from homeschooling background and things like that. And so we heard about his talks at the YWCA once a month on Saturday morning. So we went down and we all sat on the floor. He had a chair, and your grandmother had a chair, and he would sit there, and they'd bring in these gunny sacks. You know what a gunny sack is?
Yes, I do.
He would bring in 2 or 3 bags of gunny and lay them by his chair, and then he would pull out the dried remains of different animals and sort of hold them in his hands and make them look very realistic. And he would tell all about their life and what they did to help the country, the part of the balance of nature. And he would go through these different dried, because he would just dry them. And I mean, they weren't taxidermied, treated or anything. They were just dry skins and carcasses of all of the various animals and things, and eat insects. Sometimes he'd bring some insects, grasshoppers or things like that. And he would tell about what kept the land going and how you take care of the land. Of course, that was after northeastern New Mexico was still involved in the Dust Bowl era and the drought era that went 33, 34, 35. We were involved. And so during the early years of the war, it was still a fairly fresh memory for most of us. And he did this for children that between 6 and 12 or 14, something like that was the age limit. And we'd sit there, and he said, now when you sit down, you're going to stay there for 2 full hours without squirming around. He was very strict about that. He didn't want us poking each other or playing or anything like that. But he was fascinating. I mean, we were entertained the whole 2 hours that he was there. Then they would return to Santa Fe. And I always thought that was such a wonderful thing that he did for the young people in Albuquerque during the Second World War. I finished Manzano in 1944. He was there in that period of time between 41 and 44, the early years of the Second World War, that I was privileged to get acquainted with him and to how it wonderfully was sharing his knowledge and trying to educate the children. When we got there, we sat down and, kind of gathered around your grandfather so we could all hear. My brother and I were the 2 that attended it that I knew, and I didn't know the other children.
Do you remember about how many kids came each week?
Well, it depended an awful lot on the home activities and what, but I think there was probably at least between 12 and 20 kids there. And, it varied because people didn't know what. We were so involved in the war effort that you never knew. Some of the families couldn't get their children there every time, and I really don't know. And we didn't visit very much. We all had chores to do, and, we'd come Saturday morning and try and be there 2 hours, and then we were told to go home and there was no loitering or things like that on the streets. And everybody walked to get there. of the gas rationing. I couldn't tell you where the YWCA was, but it was downtown Albuquerque, as I recall, sort of in the vicinity of the big Episcopal church there in downtown Albuquerque.
Okay.
In that general vicinity.
Did he ask you all to do anything in particular with the war effort?
Well, I was so involved in the war effort because I worked the cattle depot in where is now Rio Rancho. It was an area that had cattle in it, and all of the ranchers were producing beef for the military. We worked whenever we weren't in school. I had borrowed a horse from Louis Clifford, who had the taxi cab company, and he had 2 horses that he used during the state fair parade every year, and they were just stabled out at the fairgrounds. And my brother and I would borrow them, and we would help any ranchers that got an allocation on a railroad car to ship cattle. We'd help them pen there at Belen, south of Albuquerque, and along the railroad, because that's where the railroad cattle pens were. And we were, I really don't know, we kids, there was no loitering around or anything like that. We all had chores to do and things like that. I couldn't really honestly answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Did you read any of his books? And if so, did you own them or did you get them from the library?
See, we lived up at the ranch. My grandmother, her children, my dad's generation, had been educated on the ranch. My great-grandfather was a professor, and he at Heidelberg and was teaching, came to America to start the public school system in Cincinnati, and ended up with tuberculosis and came west and got cured. And that's how my grandmother's family ended up in the Tequesquite Valley, because he was an educated man and he got the post office job. Her father did. So I had read all of his books that, were published by then, because my grandmother had a wonderful library for her children, and then we shared it. Of course, my brothers and I did. So we had read his books. The thing I remember about your grandfather, he was so fascinating to listen to and to talk to us and to tell us all this wonderful knowledge about all of us loved animals, and his talking about his time when he was in northeastern New Mexico. My brother and I felt that he was the only person that knew where northeastern New Mexico was in the ranches. And the fact that he just held the attention of this entire group of kids between 6 and, I think it was 6 and 12, and that's maybe 14, because I was one of the older ones. He had such an amazing presence, and he was very kind as long as you behaved yourself and, didn't cause any ruckus or anything or ask too many questions. He was so kind and caring to all of us. We knew from the very beginning, if we made noises or scuffled around or anything, that we'd be evicted from the class. And we all loved it. All I remember is how he had a commanding presence and a wonderful voice, and how very interesting he was, and how he did it. He did it all without notes. I mean, He'd just bring these bags of dried, I don't know what they call them, but he kept them in drawers, and I think they were dried skins of the various animals he talked about, carcasses and all. Every other day I have to drive the feed wagon, so thank you very much. I say part of my youth was influenced by your grandfather and his wonderful knowledge, and the fact that my grandfather had known him, and as young men, they had covered a lot of the same territory up here.
Thank you, Linda. This concludes our interview with Linda Davis and her experience with Ernest Thompson Seton. Visit us on the web at https:// etseatoninstitute.org